Hello everyone and welcome to our fifth session today. أهلا وسهلا بالجميع في الجلسة الخامسة من منتدى الاستشاريين الإداريين السعوديين الأول. This session is going to be in English about benchmark framework guide with MCAN team. I'm introducing Ms. Nida. Hi Ms. Nida. She will carry on from this.
Thank you so much, Ella, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. For today's session, we're going to cover the Benchmark Framework Guide on day 2 of the SAMCA conference. Next slide, please. So with me today, my name's Nida. I'm a senior manager at MCAN. With me today, I have my colleagues, Ms. Amna and Ms. Ranad, who are both senior consultants at MCAN. If we can just go to the next slide. So I'll be presenting, but I'll be relying on my colleagues also to facilitate the session. So what are our goals for the session? Starting with is to understand benchmarking. Why do we do benchmarking? What is its purpose? And we will illustrate the benchmarking approach and the steps that we take. And then collectively, we will do a high-level benchmarking approach, a case study, if you may, where we'll identify some framework elements and some competitors to benchmark. The agenda for today's session is as follows. We'll allocate about 10 minutes for the purpose and defining benchmarking. We'll go over the approach, and then we'll dive right into the group activity, which will take approximately 25 minutes. And then we will talk about some benchmarking pitfalls and potential solutions. And then we conclude with final remarks and any questions that you might have. Okay, next slide. So we want to make this session as interactive as possible. And so we seek your input, we seek your questions. So please have your camera ready. So you'll have when the QR code appears, you just need to scan the QR code, and then you will be able to enter your answer. My colleagues will also be sharing the link in the Zoom chat box. So if in case the QR code does not work for any reason, please refer to the chat box and you can click on it and then enter your responses. Okay, let's start then. So starting with benchmarking defined. So we'll dive right into an activity. So please have your camera ready and just scan the QR code. In it, you will get some responses of what the definitions of benchmarking. Please click one of the answers which you think that defines benchmarking best. So is it option number 1? It's a trends in specific market. Is it an improvement strategies? Is it a study to compare and evaluate performances, practices, and processes? Or is it a study to compare key performance indicators? So if you can just scan the code, it's on the top right of the screen. And also Amna or Ranad will be sharing oh, perfect. They've loaded up. Have we got the responses? All right. I'll give you 30 seconds to enter that. Okay, I see that we've got 10 responses. That's great. Okay, so we can now just see the answers. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so the actual answer is point number 3. So it's a study to compare and evaluate the performance, practices, and processes of an organization product, either internally or externally. So we can go to the next slide, slide number 9. So how do we define benchmarking? So it's a process of comparing metrics, performance, or practices of a client's entity. This could be internal or external. When you're looking at internal, you could be comparing performance or the metrics and practices of an entity's division or department. So if you imagine a large organization, they have multiple locations within country or internationally, you can benchmark their performance metrics across the different divisions and departments, all within the client's entity. Otherwise, it's also there externally. External benchmarks looks at what are the competitors and the best-in-class entities or international systems do. And this can be applied within and or across industries or sectors. In terms of internal and external benchmarking, there's different types of benchmarking that falls within it. So if we can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there's internal and external benchmarking. We can have a process benchmarking. You can have a performance competitor benchmarking and a strategic benchmarking. So a process benchmarking is how do you accomplish certain specific business processes? So it could be examining internally or externally a client's operations. If you're looking at performance and competitor benchmarking, you could be looking at what is the client's entity based on certain defined performance metrics, whether it be price offering, market share, market capitalization. And then you've got strategic benchmarking. How do you define and how do you come up with winning strategies and performances? So a strategic benchmarking can also include some process benchmarking and performance and competitor benchmarking. These are not discrete and they can be done in combination. Next slide. So why do we do benchmarking? Sometimes we think of it as just a research activity that we just have to tick off, but actually it is really quite an important and integral part when working on a project and when working on a strategy. So to begin with, one of the objectives is to identify performance gaps. So what is the performance gaps between the client's entity and the benchmark best practices leaders? And through this benchmarking exercise, you can identify how this gap can be closed. You can find examples of superior performance so that you can better understand better processes, practices that can create leading performances. It also helps to contextualize and tailor the best practices that you put forward to your client, whether it be for their strategic goals, their strategy, operations. And then more importantly, it's really to drive the answers for specific questions and points in the strategy that you're seeking to answer. The benchmarking is key because not only will you be able to back your recommendations, not only will you be able to identify, but you'll be able to justify your recommendations to the client with demonstrated evidence of international or local best practices. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, benchmarking is one of the key components when designing a client's strategic direction, recommendation, and implementation plan. As with every project, we start off with the client or key stakeholders and partners' aspiration. This it sets the tone and the strategic direction for the project. So one of the first activities we do is we conduct a landscape assessment. So typically we do a benchmarking exercise and we also do a current state assessment. So it's really important that when you design both the benchmarking and current state assessment deliverables and the framework, you design them collaboratively together because what you're seeking to answer in the current state has to be mapped very clearly to the international benchmarking. So from the international and local benchmarking, you'll identify best practices and performances. And this will enable you to contextualize that to your client. From the current state, what you will identify is performance gaps or challenges within the local landscape. This is why you need both deliverables, both activities, both exercises to speak to each other to ensure that there's consistent and alignment and insights across both fronts. There's no point in doing a current state assessment, identifying a gap, and then you realize later down when you're trying to define your strategy that you really don't know what the international best practice is in regards to this. So in order to formulate a very comprehensive, holistic, and contextualized recommendations, it's really, really important that both the current state assessment and the international benchmarking mirror each other in what we're trying to find. And you're able to identify key findings and best practice and formulate those recommendations that are best suited to the client and the local context. So once you have these best practices and performances, you're then able to formulate the strategic direction, the design, and the recommendation. And then subsequently, you're able to define a implementation plan. So as you can see, it's really quite important because the strategy that you design for your client is heavily built on not only the local landscape and market needs, but what are the benchmark best practices identified? And then, of course, the needs and positioning and aspirations of the client. Okay, next slide. So in terms of benchmarking approach, so how do we go about this exercise? So what are the key steps that you need to take when you're benchmarking? Next slide. So we've identified that there are 5 specific steps. So we start with first identifying what you're benchmarking. Then we define what the benchmarking framework is. Then we collect data on it. Then we analyze the data. And then finally, we contextualize the findings. So let's start with step number 1. So identify what you're benchmarking. What are the specific goals? What are you trying to answer in your strategy and or for your client with this benchmarking exercise? It's really, really important that you understand and have a clear understanding what is the client's ask and what is the client's aspiration. You need to identify the scope of your benchmarking. So this is sometimes, clients, they want an extensive list of benchmark countries, but you need to be able to identify for the time period that you can conduct the benchmarking, how many benchmarks are you going to do? Are you going to do 7 benchmark countries, 7 benchmark companies? Are you going to do 10? So the scope and the level, the depth of your benchmarking has to be agreed. And then what areas are you looking at? So are you looking at specific industries? Are you looking at this operations? So you really need to define really clear selection criteria on which countries, which systems you're seeking to benchmark. And it's really, really important at this stage to get the client sign off. More often than not, clients usually have a perspective. They want you to investigate, identify certain systems or countries or companies. So they will have a very much a say in what are the benchmarking. So what are your benchmarking elements? This is critical because really this does set the blueprint for your data collection. So what are you benchmarking exactly? Are you looking at market share? Are you looking at the operations aspect? Are you looking at the marketing? So you really need to define what your framework elements are, depending on what you intend. So again, you have to look at, contextualize it. Are you looking at related industries, similar organizations, relatable context? Again, this is another step that you need to get your benchmark framework aligned and signed off with the client. And again, this has to map the current state assessment framework that you're putting together. Then comes the fun part of actually collecting the data. So you will source and validate data from a range of credible sources. So this can be reports, desktop research, expert interviews. We'll delve into that a bit later in the slide further down. So during the data collection phase, you will be encountering a large volume of data. So it's very, very important that you save, cite, and reference data as you go. Not only, so what we usually have is a directory of all the sources that we've used. We record that, and then of course, when we are presenting our findings in a report, we always cite this because clients do want to see the recommendations they're coming from a credible source. Then comes the analysis of the data and the report findings. You need to be able to compile and categorize the data. You'll have a large volume of data, whether it be qualitative and quantitative data. How you structure that, how you analyze the data to find the best practice in the performance and gaps is the key. And then can you take that large volume of data and succinct it and make it to illustrate the key findings clearly and concisely? So more often than not, you have so many recommendations, you have so many key best practices and key findings that you want to share with the client, but you have to really be quite critical and distill the key findings that you think are most suited to the client, most suited and most relevant to the client, and put that forward in a very clear and concise manner. And then finally, of course, the contextualizing findings based on a client's needs. So when you're looking for areas of opportunities for improvement or identifying shortlisting best practices, again, always come back to your client's needs, the client's context. It might have worked really well in another country. It might have worked really well. A best practice would have worked really well in another company, but does it actually suit your client's purpose and client's context, your client's current capacity? These are all keys that when you're contextualizing the findings and before you present it to the client that you need to really look at. So again, getting clients sign off at this step is also integral. It's very vital because, as of course, this then feeds into how you would go about designing the strategy, as we saw from the previous slide. Right. Next slide, please. So where can we find all this rich, credible data and sources when conducting a benchmark? So there are usually four areas or where we could go and we seek to get common sources of information. So there are research papers and articles, desktop research, expert and stakeholder interviews, and databases. So let's start with research papers and articles. So there's a lot of good literature review that can really help to support the data that you need for your benchmark. So these could include international publications, World Economic Forum, university research, Harvard Business Review usually puts up some really good findings. And also we also do leverage consultancy reports. So from our peers, other organizations, other consultancies, houses such as MBBs, the Big Four, local SMEs, because they may have already done the exercise and have really valuable and rich data that they've already gathered, analyzed, and presented. So this is also a very good, rich source of data. In terms of desktop research, as you know, government ministry websites, information from the company or entity, looking at newspapers online. So very reputed, very prestigious sources of data, whether it be The Economist, Wall Street Journal, BBC. So again, it's finding many other reliable online sources. And then, of course, you have databases. So online databases that have verified or run analysis on the data collected. In Saudi, for example, we have the General Authority for Statistics in Saudi. Then there's also other official databases such as Bloomberg, Statista, Euromonitor. Again, these are all the data has been analyzed and looked at very clearly. And then you can, of course, leverage a lot of rich data from these sources. But what happens when you don't have the missing, there's some missing gaps? We also supplement that with expert and stakeholder interviews. So we conduct these interviews to verify the robustness and credibility of the data. So if we found something, say, in the desktop research, and we want to validate that, we double check through the experts and the stakeholders. Sometimes there's missing data. That's another opportunity for us also to seek out the experts and stakeholders and interview them so that we can get a more holistic and comprehensive information for our benchmarking. So common avenues on how to identify local or international subject matter experts. We will tap into our networks at MCAN and our partner networks. We've also got the clients networks, which we can leverage, a consultancy firms network, as I mentioned. And then, of course, there's LinkedIn. We also look at publications. So sometimes when we're trying to identify leading experts, we look at international publications, go to the author's page or the appendix, and we identify some subject matter experts from there. And this has been a very good approach, and we've been able to secure and identify very prominent names of experts to help us in the benchmarking exercise, but also in setting the strategy. All right, I think that concludes it in terms of the information source. If we can just go to the next slide, I believe any questions? So I know that was quite a bit of information to take in. Does anybody, I'm opening the floor right now, if anybody has any questions. My understanding is if you can just write it on the ANA platform, my colleagues here would then post the questions here onto Zoom, in the Zoom chat box, and then we can definitely respond. So Or is everything super clear and straightforward, and everyone's a benchmarking expert now? Okay. Okay, I don't see any questions yet. So let's go right into the group activity. Not to worry, we will open up the floor later. So giving you an opportunity to ask any questions about the benchmarking framework and our approach. So let's do a fun activity together. The client case is, it's a leading Saudi Arabian automotive company. They want to enter the growing electrical vehicle market, both locally and internationally. So they've appointed your consulting firm to develop a marketing and entry strategy that really allow them to launch a premium electrical vehicle car by the year 2027. So right now, you're doing a current state assessment, and the first task that you have to do is to conduct an international competitive benchmarking of top EV manufacturers to uncover the best practices to allow them to position, launch, and promote this new electrical vehicle in the country as well as internationally. Okay. All right. I will save the question for the end, so we can, Amna, if you can just record that question, and then we'll come back to it at the end. All right. So let's start with the first case study. So if we can go to the next page. So pull out your phone, please, and scan the code. So the first question that we have is, what global electrical vehicle companies or manufacturers will you look at when you're doing this benchmarking exercise? Okay, so if you can just scan the code and enter your responses. Okay. Perfect. I'll give you a minute to get your responses in. Okay, I see Tesla. Great. I see. And I'll need help with the Arabic for this. Okay, I see 2 Teslas. Great. Okay. Oh, Tesla's leading by far. I think they've done a very good job in positioning themselves as an electrical vehicle. Oh, wow. Okay, a lot of Teslas. Oh, we almost gave away the answer, but okay. I think everyone's just. I think it really says a lot that Tesla is one of the leading responses because they've. Oh, a BMW, one of my favorite car brands. So thank you for whoever said that. Oh, Hyundai, that's great. Toyota, yeah, great. Lucid, yes, thank you. I was educated by my my colleagues, Ranad and Amna, about Lucid. So thank you for mentioning that. Mercedes-Benz, perfect. Audi, okay. Audi's also in that space. Oh yeah, Toyota again, perfect. Lucid. I really need to read up on Lucid and all their offerings, because much like some other people, I was just more focused on Teslas and BMW. All right. So, Ford. Chinese electrical car manufacturers, yes, very true. They're up and coming, and they're operating in this space. If there's any, okay, I think we've got big names already here. That's really great. So thank you for that. So the next response, so we're going to illustrate for the purposes of this, so the key steps. So who did we identify and select? So we selected, much like everyone was saying, Tesla. We've got BMW over there. We've got Lucid. We've got Nissan. We've got Hyundai. And then there was another one, Rivian. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I'm not very proficient with cars, but I've learned through this exercise. So when we are selecting these companies and relevant companies to benchmark, you really need to have a clear selection criteria. Why are you choosing them? What is the strong qualitative and quantitative rationale behind them? Are you looking at it because of the brand name, their positioning in the market? Are you looking at it in terms of the years of operations, the number of market share? So really, when you're proposing these companies, competitors to them, to your client, you really need to make sure that there's a strong rationale of why you're choosing these these companies. Again, I'm not saying that these are the definite ones and these are the only ones that should go forward, but these would be some of the top names that we would put forward. And then you'd also have to really clarify with the client the number and the names of the companies you're proposing to benchmark. Sometimes clients want 10, 20 benchmarks, but are you really going to get much further insight if you dilute your efforts, or are you going to propose some really strong 5 to 7 strong benchmarks that is really backed by strong qualitative and quantitative reasoning? So if I take an example, recently when we did it on a ministry project in KSA, the client wanted to understand the rationale behind choosing certain countries to benchmark for an education system. And when we looked at it, they weren't really convinced with a certain country that we had proposed. But when we were able to demonstrate how that country and that its respective educational system were able to generate strong student outcomes, what was the qualitative and quantitative findings behind it, they were able to cross the line. So similarly, when you're doing a benchmarking in this exercise, it's really, really important that you confirm with the client and you have strong rationale and reasoning on why you're choosing these benchmark companies, and then also how many you're going to do, because the benchmarking does take some time and you don't want to find yourself doing 10 to 20 benchmarks and getting very little insights, whereas you can just do 5 to 7 really, really well. Okay. The next question. Camera's ready again. So what aspects of the car design and features would you look at when you're comparing your client's intended car design to that of a car, to that of its competitor? So from the 7 names or the names that you mentioned earlier, what would you look at? Okay, look, I agree. It's very important how it looks. If it looks classy and premium. Price is a feature that you would look. Any other car design and features that you would look at within the car itself? Because I think everyone's driving for the price aspect. Okay. Price, features. Will be good. If anybody wants to elaborate more about what type of features that you would look at when you're looking at the car design. Again, think electrical vehicle, think the technology behind it. Yep. How does it run? Price and functions. The cost. I think price is a main factor. Horsepower. Okay, we have a car enthusiast. Yes. How fast does it go? Does it compete against the Ferrari and Lamborghinis? Is it the size? Yes, that's an important one. The complexity of battery lifetime, that's very important for electrical vehicles, how quick the battery discharge. Legal regulation standards, very interesting. Yes, I didn't think about that, but that is a good point, because certain countries might have regulations and standards when it comes to car design and features that might impact battery life, definitely. How far it goes, cost and ease of recharging. Whoever said that, thank you for that, because that is quite integral and important, because we have many petrol stations all over, but not always not always are we able to find ports to charge up the car. So the cost and ease of charging. Okay, number of sales. Okay, the maintenance cost. So regarding the car design and features, yes, how much is the upkeep? That could be one of the features. I think people are going into the next element that we would dig further. So that's good. Supply chain, you've actually revealed an answer that was going to come for the next element. So thank you for that. We'll just go on to the next question, because that just responded to the next element. Okay, so I think some of you have already responded. to the question previously, but what other benchmarking elements other than car design and features would you look at? For example, local and global market share. If you're looking at the company holistically, what other aspects would you look at? So again, please scan the QR code and hopefully we'll get the responses. The quality, yeah, the durability of it. Yeah, that's a good point. You don't want something that will be breakdown. Yes, how many suppliers there are? That is quite critical. The supplies and the components that goes into the making of the car, it's very important. Target demographic market, yes. Who are you seeking to address? Is it young professionals? Is it older professionals? The quality, company growth, yep. The years of experience that they have, the operations, history. Definitely. The number of years of establishment, because some companies, like as we saw with Tesla, I think they've just rooted themselves into electrical vehicle, even though some other car makers might have done it before. But Tesla's history has always been about electric vehicles, so they're really well known. Companies, organization structure, operating model. Yes, I would say yes to the operating model, only because you'd need to know how that would be designed, how to organize the logistical aspects when it comes to supply chain, marketing, etc. Competition level in the market, yes, that goes well with the market share. Environmental impact, that's very key because the sustainability initiative, because again, people who are driven to purchase electrical vehicles do look at the sustainability and the environmentally impact. Financial model investment, yes, that is very much linked into R&D, research and development. So what are some aspects that you'd have to look at? That would be very important because you'll put a lot of money in to develop these technologies, and you'll need to understand what other companies are doing. So those are industry organizational goals, and if it's important to select the most relevant benchmark. Yes, exactly. The objectives and so you have to make sure that the benchmarking and the benchmarking exercise, when you define the benchmarking framework, that is very much aligned to your client's aspirations, goals, etc. And who owns it? In terms of ownership, yes, if it's public, private, that also has implications on how you design the strategy. All right. Thank you for all those responses. They've been great, and I think they very much align to what we have, what we thought about. So if you can go to the next slide, please. All right, so car design elements. So some of the items that we came up with were battery technology, like the battery type, the capacity and placement, the charging infrastructure integration. So someone already mentioned that earlier. So the compatibility and the port convenience. Can I find a place to recharge it very quickly? The range and efficiency. Again, the efficiency of it, like how far can the car go within a charge? The interior and comfort. A lot of you identified that. So the interior layout, the materials, the infotainment, what are the sound system, the TV, the screens, all that. That would be really important for someone like me. I really look at the interiors and the comfort features, and then of course the safety features. Does the car with the old, does it meet safety standards, and how well does it do in crash test ratings? So other benchmarking elements when we looked at, similar to what was already responded, market share, what is its presence, the capitalization of each potential benchmark, what is the share of the client right now, right? In the electrical vehicle will be non-existent, but how does that compare to its competitor, and what are the strategies that you'll put in place to close that gap? Supply chain, someone had mentioned that's very important to optimize and reduce costs and ensure that there's a consistent supply of critical components. I mean, COVID taught us that a slight disruption in a supply chain can create havoc down the line. So what are the measures that they take in regards to that, and in which country. So it's not only that you're getting your parts from certain countries, only your local countries or your partner countries, but you're getting parts for the car from a diverse range of countries where you have different political as well as trade relationships with. So it's really important to look at that. Technology innovation. So what are the innovation and demonstrated by these companies? So the EV technology, design, and features. Some of them will keep that a secret. They would not want to fully reveal what they're working on in terms of the next R&D and technological innovation, so that they want to keep that secret in house till they launch the project. But then sometimes they do put out teasers where they will talk about like what next for that brand. And then sustainability initiatives in terms of somebody had identified exactly the commitment of each company to sustainability, to be sustainable, efforts to promote renewable energy, because more often than not, people who buy electrical vehicles, they're looking at the broader initiatives. So what else does the company do in terms of sustainability and being environmentally friendly? All right. Okay. That's great. So again, this answers is not fully, it's just a flavor of what we would cover, but I'm sure that there's other elements too. So what are some pitfalls and potential solutions? So what happens when you do a benchmarking and sometimes things don't always go to plan? So what are some common pitfalls? So starting with number one, not defining what you're seeking to answer. If you do not know what you're seeking to answer in your strategy, you're setting yourself up to fail. So you need to clearly define what you will be answering in your strategy at the start. And then based on that, you have to design your benchmark framework and approach. It's really counterproductive if you get to the strategy point and then you realize, oh, I didn't investigate this, I didn't investigate that. So this benchmarking exercise, you have to be comprehensive and you have to think about it holistically and really define what are you seeking to answer at the end. Choosing irrelevant companies or systems. So analyzing, it's carefully selecting comparator benchmarks in light of the project and client or local context. So as much as possible, we want to compare apples to apples. So for here, in this example, we wouldn't choose a car manufacturer that does not have an electrical vehicle. We would not choose, for example, if we were doing an educational system benchmark, even though Finland has the best educational best practices and is one of the leading countries that we can learn from, I would not necessarily put that always forward because the population makeup, the demographics of Finland and the way that this educational system is structured is vastly different to KSA. So even though they might have very good practices that we can somewhat identify and aspire to, it's not always contextual. So again, choosing the relevant companies and systems is really important. Finding irrelevant or insufficient elements. Sometimes you don't go too deep. The benchmark framework itself, you haven't identified all the elements. So the exercise that we did previously, we looked at it in a snapshot, but I'm sure there might be other elements that you'd look at. So really thinking about it holistically with your team together, what should be covered in the investigation. And sometimes when you're doing the benchmarking exercise, you uncover new elements and which you haven't thought about. So again, refining, updating, amending the benchmarking framework as you go along to make sure that you are looking at the data holistically and you're covering all grounds. And then what I used to struggle with and is what distinguishing and prioritizing what is must know and have, or what's nice to know and have. Sometimes I get so excited getting all the information as a benchmark. I'm like, I want to show all of this to the client, but it's too much. So what you need to know is what are the relevant information that would be applicable and the client needs to know. What should they know? And what is a nice to know. So nice to know. And it could be, and you can deprioritize that. So of course, you'd always have to prioritize the must knows and haves based on what you're going to be answering in the strategy. And then missing a lack of available data. So in terms of a lack of available data, selecting benchmarks when we have limited public info available and or there's language barriers. For example, recently we were trying to benchmark the Korean educational system. So even though Korea has a very strong educational system, especially in arts and culture education, unfortunately, we weren't able to get the necessary information because a lot of the information was in Korean, and a lot of the publications that came out did not answer any questions that we had. So how do we fill in this missing information? We tried to fill it in by validating our findings, by approaching the entities and the organizations themselves, conducting stakeholder meetings and interviews, and or we also supplemented it by identifying an expert who has experience working within the Korean educational system, and then using their expertise to answer any missing data or lack of data. And then we also become creative. We broaden our information source and searches. So we'll look at forums. We'll look at what's, for example, when we were looking at teaching best practices, there's a lot of really good teacher blogs where we can get this information from. So again, missing or lack of data available is an issue, especially from systems where there's not always the data available or collected and presented or accessible, but there are always workarounds on filling this missing information and gap. Okay. I think that concludes our presentation, and I really thank you for your being with us and participating in today's session. And I'm going to open up the floor for any questions. I'm going to go back to one of the questions that we had. How can I be sure that the data I collected are valid? So that was one of the questions that came through. Very good question. So one of the ways that we can make sure that the data that you're collected is valid is triangulating and verifying it. So for example, if I get a report and I say that in the report it says that there is 500,000 teachers in KSA. I can also supplement that data by looking at the database again. So the report, a publication report says that this is what it is. I would choose another source of data. So I look at the databases. I would also then, for example, go to the Ministry of Education. And if they're one of the stakeholders I would interview, I would validate that figure with them from their reports and their records. So always confirming and reconfirming your data collection and making sure that it's valid is very, very important. And then if you're able to cite multiple sources, this reinforces its credibility and validity, and really shows the client and demonstrates to the client that you've been very comprehensive in checking that these data is valid. Okay. So another question we have is there a specific format in delivering the reports of benchmarking? There's no specific format, I would say, but for the purposes at MCAN, what we usually do is we usually do it on PowerPoint. I think that it's a lot easier to do. I'm not really a fan of Word documents because sometimes there's a lot of key findings that you're trying to illustrate, and sometimes Word is not always the most useful tool. So what we do is we put together a PowerPoint. We put together a PowerPoint deck. Sometimes benchmark deliverables can be like 700, 800 pages, depending on how many systems and how many elements that you're benchmarking. So it'll be quite a heavy deck. We try to make it, as visual as possible with very clear key findings illustrated. So what we will do is we'll have a extensive long deck, which is 700, 800 pages, slides. And then from that, we will present an executive summary, and both formats of them are done in PowerPoint because it's just a very easy tool to use, and you are able to illustrate very complex and a lot of information in a very visual and very concise manner. Okay. Any more questions? All right. I think there's I'll give you a minute. And if there's any more questions that anyone has, we'll be happy to answer that. We were good for time. We actually finished well before, so that's good. Okay, question here is, in my opinion, what is the most valuable source of data, and what is the most type used as a source for data? So it really depends what exactly you're seeking to answer. So, for example, in terms of valuable sources of data, if it's coming from the client or the partner entity, you know that the data that they give you directly is valid and most up to date. For example, we were working on a project with the Ministry of Education, and they had, of course, the Ministry of Education publishes their report annually. And we wanted to validate if certain student numbers, the number of universities, the number of teachers was still valid, or if they've grown or decreased. So what I would do is, for me, just to double check. So the report, the source of truth was initially the Ministry of Education report, but then we reconfirmed that with the Ministry of Education directly also. More often than not, we really rely on the client and the partner or the KSA stakeholder authorities, entities, reports and data. But then we also look at a lot at literature review. Ultimately, it depends on what is the data that you're trying to collect. If you're looking at, for example, data about the population makeup of KSA, I would just use databases, the Government Statistical Authority database. But if you're looking for very specific data that is not publicly available, it's always good to go directly to the source of that entity or that authority or that ministry. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the research publications that are done by universities internationally, that are done by World Economic Forum, UNESCO. These are big entities that have a vast amount of data that you know are credible, valid, and they're also cited. So you can also use that too. So I would say two sources that I would commonly go to are the literature review, as well as directly to the stakeholder or partners or the authorities database. I think that's it. We don't have any more questions. I really thank you for your time. I hope you found this session informative. Thank you so much for your engagement, and just wishing you all the best in your benchmarking exercise. If you have any questions for us later, we'll be happy to answer your questions offline. But yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amna. Thank you, Renad, for your support on this, and thank you everyone for participating. I'll also that I still have time for Q&A. If there's any more questions, happy to go. You have another 10 minutes, 5 minutes, sorry, apologies. There was one question: how can I be sure that the collected data are valid or up to date? So I believe I've answered the validity earlier. How to make sure it's up to date? Just know when the data was released. So obviously there will always be citations of when it was last collected, last up to date. Sometimes, for example, the data, there is a long time between the data being collected and the data being analyzed. So, of course, for example, PISA, OECD, the results for the educational attainments, they collect the data and then they publish the report like about 2 years later, I believe. And so you always have to look at the year the data was collected and is it accurate? Is it the most recent? I've answered the question about the format and delivering benchmarking report and how long the benchmarking usually takes. That's a good question. So it really depends of how extensive your benchmarking takes, how deep your benchmarking has to be for the scope. So as I mentioned, if your client wants you to benchmark 10 to 20 entities, and you're looking at about 10 to 15 benchmarking elements, that could take a while. Typically, when we are doing about 5 to 7 benchmarks, and then we'll have about 10 elements or 10 or 15 elements to benchmark, because we go quite deep. It would take approximately 4 to 5 weeks. So we conduct the benchmark alongside the current state assessment. So give yourself time. If it's a high level benchmarking, sometimes they just want a quick benchmarking because either the client already knows what they've done the exercise before, or they know what the ask is, and they don't want you to spend too much time on it. You can do a benchmarking in 2 to 3 weeks, but realistically 4 to 5 is the typical time frame that you would give yourself. That it? I think I've answered all the other questions. Any more questions? Also, feel free to ask it in Arabic, because I have my colleagues here, Amna and Ranad, and they're also benchmarking experts, so I'm sure they can also respond. Okay, so if there's not enough data, difficulty to access data, few literature published, what are the most valuable sources of data? So if there's not enough data and having access, so if it's not through literature review, I would strongly urge looking at the different databases. If that's not there, what often we do, more often than not, we do it through stakeholder interviews. So we get our information from if it's an international firm or entity, we schedule a meeting with them. We tell them the purpose of the exercise, and we get information that way. And, or as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we get subject matter experts, and subject matter experts are ingrained in the system. So they're ingrained and they work in that industry or in that specific sector. So they're able to access, insider information, which you might not be privy to. So really broaden your search. Don't only just look at literature review, but look at the different databases, have meetings with the different entities, and then really onboard and identify and onboard and interview subject matter experts who will be able to get that information. Maybe not even, sometimes more often than not, they have a network of experts or people who work in that industry, so they're able to access it. So for example, we have an educational expert in Australia, but he's well connected to someone for example, in Korea. So they were able to facilitate that introduction. So really, really leveraging the networks that you have, the subject matter experts, as well as any entities. More often than not, international entities, international system, they are welcoming, and they do entertain, and they do allow for interviews. So getting the information from them is that is an avenue, but then we also are mindful that sometimes certain information is protected and they can release it publicly. So you just have to be mindful of that. And yep, and I've answered the question.
Nida, or we have more questions. If you're able to answer more questions, and we can finish at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Allah. Good. If there's any more questions, we're good to go. Don't see anything else. I think everyone hopefully now feel a bit more comfortable with the benchmarking.
Thank you, Nida. Thank you, Imkan team. That was wonderful. Thank you a lot for the session. We'll see you, inshallah, after half an hour. We'll have a break from 3 to 3:30, and then we're going to resume the sessions. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Allah. Thanks, and our team. Thank you.